Good afternoon and welcome to CEC Gurukul lecture. In the series on sociological research method, in today's lecture, I am going to talk about comparative methods. And for here, the reference is Andre Bette's work on some observation on comparative method. We see that Andre Bette kind of is trying to understand how comparative method has been used in sociology and social anthropology, the critical examination of the method and ways in which it can be further improved. So, we know much of us who are familiar to sociology know that Andre Bette has been an influential Indian sociologist, and he did rigorous empirical work on social stratification in India, specifically his work on caste, class and power. His view on comparative methods are central to his broader sociological approach and are characterized by a critical engagement with historical pitfall and a call for more sensitive and even-handed analysis. He strongly critiqued the tendency to make a dogma of the unity of mankind, where other societies are seen not just as different but as imperfect or unformed copies of one's own. This was particularly evident in the 19th century evolutionary theory, which assumed Western society had achieved the highest institutional advancement and that other society would inevitably follow the same path. While this theory lost favor in the 20th century, its underlying spirit, Bethe argued, was rekindled in the development theory. So, the comparative method was basically trying to re-strengthen the hierarchy between the West and the East and kind of putting across the generalization that the Western society were kind of far ahead in development, and therefore we have these categories called development, developing society, where most of the societies from a non-Western context are put into the category of developing. So, the two critique that he's pointing out, one that the Western society anthropologists were trying to point out to their own uniqueness or advancement, and the other was in terms of partial understanding of development itself, and that is from a Western perspective. Now, when we look into the problem of the comparative method, the most evident is that there was a call for the idea of arriving at universal understanding, or how the certain institutions were universally prevalent in all kind of society. So, the core message is a call for more even-handed approach in comparative study, and one that acknowledges both similarity and differences without dogmatically asserting that one is more fundamental than the other. Andre Bethe admits that this might sound simplistic, but he stresses its importance due to shift that has been taken place. Traditionally, the comparative method from scholars like Durkheim to Radcliffe Brown involved researchers from one part of the world studying societies globally, including their own. So, since the discipline was evolving and much of the credit has been in the part of the Western society, they were kind of all scholars were located in the West and were studying the East. This kind of dogmatic comparison became significant. However, there was a lot of shift that took place, and it led to kind of an arbitrary distinction. Studying one's own society was sociology, and studying another culture was anthropology. So, earlier we would kind of find a unit in most of the sociology, introduction to sociology book, where there was a kind of a section on difference between sociology and anthropology. Where sociology was defined as the study of one's own society, the industrial society, and anthropology was considered as studying the other society, or studying the primitive society, studying the other. So, this distinction was also there because most of these anthropologists from Western context were studying the other in the primitive or the simple society. So, if we look into Durkheim studying the Australian Aborigine, Radcliffe Brown studying the African society, Vance Pritchard studying the newer. So, this distinction between sociology and anthropology was artificially created. Now, this inherent objective divide between ourself and other was constructed. However, this distinction between sociology and anthropology soon started kind of becoming less important because most of the sociologists from say the so labeled other were studying their own society. So, the change and shifts were taking place. Bethe emphasizes the need for a more similarity and differences had to be more objectively studied. So, Indian scholars, there was a lot of frustration with the ingrained disciplinary division where considered sociology for one person is anthropology for another. And especially we look into India where you can kind of be in the same society and yet study the other. So, you can kind of for a simple example kind come in from say the upper caste and study the say the people lower in the hierarchy of the Varna caste hierarchy, or you can kind of come in from a urban background and study the rural. So, this distinction between sociology and anthropology, between studying your own society and studying the other society becomes problematic. Bethe introduces a second equally problematic approach in comparative study, particularly among anthropologists studying civilization and often non-Western ones. So, this again the binary between the civilized and civilizing becomes the anthropologists they kind of assumed that their state of development was achieved and those in the non-Western society were still under the process of civilizing or they was kind of undergoing this process of development, and this practice of treating the other not as an imperfect copy but as an inversion of Western civilization. So, if you kind of look into say the stratification, study of stratification in a comparison of the West and the East, we see there was a kind of again an explanation that West was an illustration of open society because it was based on class, whereas India was a closed society where there was the prevalence of this caste system. Later on with a lot of re-examination of the theories by Western scholars, they have been critiqued to these open and closed, and if you look into the M. N. Srinivas, he kind of critiques and says that caste is equally open where it provides the provision of upward mobility through the process of Sanskritization. So, this understanding of Western, non-Western society as an inversion of Western civilization stems from a widely held and sometimes expressed belief among Western scholars in the uniqueness of their own civilization. This underlying assumption sets the stage for a comparative framework where the non-Western world is defined primarily by what it is not rather than what it is. So, you are comparing it with the West and you are then understanding the East in terms of what is not present there. So, the core issue with this approach is that it leads to a distortion of non-Western civilization under study. Aspects that differ most from Western civilization receive exaggerated attention, while those that are similar receive scant attention. This creates a caricature focusing solely on exotic or contrasting elements. Andre Bethe terms this as a kind of comparative method which proceeds more by contrast than by comparison. When the primary mode is contrast with the West, the unique differences between other civilizations, example China, India, are flattened out. They are all lumped together as simply non-Western, losing their distinct characteristic and internal complexity. The past and the present of each civilization tend to be treated as one, and this is what he calls as a harmful dichotomy. It implies a static view of non-Western society, denying them the historical dynamism and internal evolution that are readily acknowledged in Western context. So, if we again read the Western discourses on Indian society, it kind of several of them tells us that the Indian society was a static society and there was a kind of a coexistence of caste system, whereas in the Western society the class was more effective as a system of stratification. So, this was coming in from the way in which the Western scholars were studying India in contrast to the West. It led to a pervasive and harmful dichotomy. Here the contrast is between Western civilization, which is dynamic and ever changing, and the other civilization which is so slow that it needs not to be taken into account. This framing perpetuates the myth of a stagnant, timeless East or South in stark contrast to perpetually progressive West. By highlighting the other as an inversion problem, Bethe points out how the very act of comparison can be skewed by number 1, implicit assumptions about one's own civilization's superiority or uniqueness. Number 2, a selective focus on differences that reinforces preconceived notions rather than a holistic understanding. Number 3, a denial of historical dynamism and internal variations within non-Western societies. Bethe points at specific example of the other as an inversion problem, focusing on the Indological approach to studying Indian society of Louis Dumont. Bethe observes that in comparison, or more accurately contrast between Indian and Western civilization, a privileged position is assigned to India's past. This means that Indian civilization is largely understood through its historical, often ancient representations. Indian civilization is portrayed by this approach as having a relatively stable or unchanging structure of values. This allows scholars to speak of the same structure, whether referring to India at present, in the recent past, or in the distant past. This directly ties into the earlier point about other civilization being viewed as having changed so slow that it need not be taken into account. These accounts of Indian society structure, even when sometimes informed by fieldwork of a very high quality, primarily derive the orientation from the representation of its classical Indian literature. The author explicitly levels this as Indological approach, which Louis Dumont as its ablest contemporary exponent. Dumont's influence is significant, extending through his writings and the journal contribution to Indian sociology. Louis Dumont contrasted his own typifying approach with the classifying approach. The typifying approach is described as comprehensive, always keeping the whole in the view when discussing any aspect of a society. The typifying approach assumes a very strong assumption of the organic unity of a civilization. Dumont sees the classifying approach as deriving from the natural sciences. He criticized it for leading to a comparison of part with part on a superficial assumption of their similarity. Louis Dumont uses his typifying approach to formulate a comprehensive contrast between India and Western, or much of the time the West is considered to be modern, advanced and developed society. Andre Bethé acknowledges that while such contrasts have been made by Western scholars since mid-19th century, Dumont is considered by many to be at once the most forceful and the most subtle. Dumont's contrasting types are embodied in the title of his two seminal work. The first one, which we are all familiar as students of sociology, is Homo hierarchicus. To understand India's social structure, you need to read Louis Dumont Homo hierarchicus. This type is constructed on the basis of hierarchy as the predominant or paramount value in Indian society, animating every aspect of life, and it gives its meaning. Hierarchy for Dumont is an aspect of holism, where the part, that is the individual, is subordinated to the whole, that is society. The second title was Homo Equalis for the West. Conversely, in Western society, according to Dumont, equality was the paramount value, an aspect of individualism. In this modern context, hierarchy is considered fundamentally meaningless. We kind of is giving example of how Western scholars were kind of using this contrast to kind of give us an idea or a picture of the West being more advanced and dynamic than the East. Bethé introduces his preferred alternative to the typifying approach of Louis Dumont, signaling a shift towards a more dynamic and less dichotomous understanding of society. He states his long-standing unease about the typifying approach, specifically citing its exaggerated contrast and its stress on difference. This directly connects to his earlier critique of treating the other as an inversion and flattening internal variation. He sees these aspects as problematic for a true enthusiast for the comparative method. And he then refers to Wertheim's work. Wertheim's work provides the intellectual framework for Bethé to articulate his misgiving and propose an alternative. Two key ideas from Wertheim are highlighted by Andre Bethé. Number one, society as a field of conflicting values. Bethé refers to Wertheim's paper, Society as a Composite of Conflicting Values, written almost 40 years prior, implying a timeless relevance. Wertheim's central insight was the coexistence of disparate elements in all human society. This directly challenges the organic unity assumptions underlying Dumont's typifying approach. The second idea from Wertheim was the idea of the counterpoint. Wertheim added this concept from his Dutch historian Jan Romein. While not fully elaborated in here, counterpoint in a sociological context typically refers to the simultaneous existence and interplay of contrasting or opposing elements within a single entity. In music, it's about independent melodies sounding together harmoniously or discordantly. In society, it would suggest that alongside dominant themes or structures, they are always alternative, dissenting, or contrasting elements that exist and interact rather than a single unified system. So, he was talking about how he could take this alternative implication and point toward a comparative approach that is less interested in grand overarching dichotomies. You know, they were trying to create two sides which are kind of almost opposed to each other. East versus the West, hierarchy versus equality, closed versus open society, dynamic versus statics. A number of these dichotomies were integral and these were emerging from the way in which comparative method was used by the Western sociologists, anthropologists to study the non-Western society. So, when we look into kind of a more holistic approach, it focuses on internal diversity, tensions and conflict within given society, whether Western or non-Western society. So, along with the comparative method and this evolution from the simple to complex was also that the focus was more in terms of functions, more in terms of the positive side, the negative, that is conflict, the tensions, diversity were neglected. So, challenge the notion of static society as conflict and multiple forces inherently imply dynamism and change. So, we need to kind of have a comparison of whole society. Bethe notes that 100 years and more after Spencer, Tyler and Durkheim, sociologists and social anthropologists still lack a universally agreed upon comparative method. Disagreement persists even if ambition about discovering grand laws of social life have been trimmed considerably. A significant problem highlighted is the inconsistency in how scholars approach comparison. While they make all sorts of comparison themselves, they judge the comparison that others make by excessively severe standards. Despite the methodological disagreement, Andre Bethe asserts that it is difficult to see how sociology and social anthropology can justify the existence without making comparison extensively and continuously. So, it's not that he is saying that there should be no comparison or comparative method is not required. Rather, on the other hand, he is saying the inevitable and comparison has a utility, but the way in which it has been used, it has to be kind of changed. So, according to Bethe, comparison is fundamental to the discipline of anthropology, sociology, and the very existence of concepts like matrilineal descent, patron-client relation, occupational mobility demonstrate that past comparison, no matter by what method, have yielded some result. Bethe supports the value of wider comparison provided they are done carefully. So, there is the problem of comparing whole society, and the core difficulty according to author lies in the idea that the comparison of whole society constitute the core of comparative method. The idea was central to Durkheim's preoccupation with social type and their classification, tied to an analogy with biological organism and the belief in social species, and Radcliffe Brown's focus on natural kind. So, there was the objective to search law, universal law, and in both Durkheim and Radcliffe Brown, we see comparison was done of the whole society, and this was considered as essential part of discovery of the laws of social life. While the prospect of such discovery has been abandoned by most sociologists and anthropologists, many continue to adhere to the belief in the importance of comparing whole society. Their persistence often manifests in the criticism of other comparative effort. So, the comparison of whole society necessitates categorization and labeling. So, you have agnatic, cognatic society, hierarchical, egalitarian, patrilineal, matrilineal. There are a lot of categories created to understand the society. So, these labels are convenient, but literally may lead to serious interpretation. So, we say that in patrilineal society there is gender inequality, but matrilineal it's a gender egalitarian relation, but it's problematic. We could find gender based violence even in matrilineal. These are only labels which has been used by anthropologists, and the reality may or may not match with this. So, it has to be a kind of a very cautious comparison, and oversimplification and misrepresentation can lead to failure, and we need to be aware of it. So, complexity and coexisting principle with any given society, and we kind of have to be very careful in terms of not bringing in our own bias to compare the other society. Rather, we to keep in mind two important questions: how and why are the comparison being made. So we need to kind of not consider it as outdated, but work on the way of modifying comparative method. So with this, we come to an end of today's lecture. Thank you.